Hello, I'm Matthew Gwyther, and welcome to this Jericho Echo Research pod videocast, which is part of the What After Woke project. Now, today I'm interviewing Sir Howard Davies, who's just stepped down as Chairman of NatWest after 9 grueling post-crash years. Howard's is a voluminous CV. He's been a diplomat, Chairman of the Financial Services Authority, Director General of the CBI. He hated that gig. He's been a board member of the Pru, Morgan Stanley, and Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. Plus, he was Director of the London School of Economics. Howard is wise, smart, serious, and now importantly, no longer shackled by having the Treasury as his biggest shareholder. So he's ready to speak his mind on a variety of subjects: woke business, climate change, tangling with Nigel Farage over that Coutts bank account, Donald Trump, Brexit. It's all in there. Have a watch. It's strong and sensible stuff.
It feels to me that we're going through momentous times at the moment. In a practical sense, from business's point of view, how's the world changed since Trump's arrival in January?
The previous assumption that we were in a rule-based international order where there was a World Trade Organization as the ultimate arbiter of free and fair trade, and a whole variety of other mechanisms which the large countries supported. We now appear to be in the art of the deal territory, where the idea of referring to any basic rules on trade has gone out the window. I mean, that's even the case with the UK government, which has done so reluctantly, but which did agree a trade deal with the US, which clearly is not compatible with WTO rules. So we're clearly now in a different environment, and businesses need to think how to position themselves in that. But it may be that it's not as catastrophic as it appeared when we listened to the president on Liberation Day, because since then he's walked back from a lot of those commitments, and the large, telephone number tariffs that he was talking about then do not appear likely to be in operation. But I would have said that for most businesses, they've got to think, well, we're going to be operating in a different kind of dog-eat-dog world, and we're therefore going to have to think about where to position our manufacturing facilities, if they're manufacturers, where to get our supplies from, because they will be vulnerable to the US. So all kinds of contingency and more planning are being undertaken by businesses. And, I have a lot of sympathy with businesses trying to position themselves in this way, because it's completely new territory.
You've been around a while and seen a fair number of shocks: the oil crisis, the financial crash, Brexit, COVID. How does this compare with what's going on at the moment? It seems to me that the major thing with this is uncertainty, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's what people call radical uncertainty, and it changes from day to day. So yes, I think it is different territory, because we really don't know whether the US will go back to something a bit similar to what they had before. That's not completely impossible if the markets push Trump that way, or we end up in a kind of new but manageable equilibrium, or we end up in a very messy and noisy trade war. And those three different scenarios, it's very difficult to handicap them.
It seems to me that there are two elements to what's going on at the moment. There's a sort of a practical economic trade element, but there's a culture war thing as well, isn't there? That is in Trump's mind and in his supporters in the States, but also in this country. Let me ask you a simple question. Did you ever feel when you were chairing NatWest that you were an unnecessarily woke organization?
We felt that we were responding largely to two things. One was from the employees, who were on the whole very keen that we should be an organization that was welcoming to a diverse crowd, and that our recruitment and training and employment practices should be, consistent with a a liberal element and consistent with moving towards a more diverse workforce. So we felt that we were responding to staff. We were not by any means an outlier at NatWest. I don't believe. We scored reasonably well on diversity measures, but not absolutely outstanding, and we didn't have any kind of pushback to our policies. So I guess that was probably one thing. And the second thing was that we were, of course, responding within the climate arena to taking the government's net zero policy seriously. We could be accused of having taken it seriously, where perhaps it wasn't intended to be taken seriously. I'm not quite sure, but we were trying to align ourselves with a long-term focus towards net zero. And indeed, we were encouraged to do that by the Bank of England because they were obliging us to do climate stress tests and to consider the emissions that we were not only producing ourselves, which was small, but also which we were financing through our loans to industry, and that should all be compatible with an approach to net zero. So those are the sort of two key areas, as it were. Diversity, I think, where I've said I think we were responding to the feelings of the staff as a whole, and then on climate change, I think we were attempting to be consistent with government policy at the time. Now, of course, in both cases, things have changed.
I mean, I think people have been really taken by surprise by the speed at which some of these American companies have fallen into line. I mean, an organization like Accenture in February of this year, led by a woman, and they've been, the poster children there for DEI stuff. And then suddenly, that having set a target that half its staff would be women by the end of 2025, they're then telling their people, we got all that completely wrong, on morally and practically, we were barking up the wrong tree. I mean, what do people inside an organization like that feel when suddenly you get that sort of volte face?
Yeah, I can't answer for Accenture people. I don't know how they feel. But it has been remarkable how the impact of using contracts with the federal government and other federal agencies has forced people to change their views for fear of being excluded. And the president using the power of procurement, if you like, to force people to do different things. And that, I think, I would say that seems to be the explanation as to why people have decided to fall into line. Now, whether it will make an enormous amount of difference, I don't know. It's hard to say because people used to be skeptical from the other direction of these targets beforehand. They say, well, so well, you have targets, but you're not really implementing them. And, they're never going to achieve it. They're just PR. And now sort of you may find people saying, well, just not having a target, that's just PR. You're still carrying on as you were before. So I don't know whether the reality of hiring decisions is going to be changed that much.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think what most businesses appear to be doing at the moment is just keeping very quiet, keeping their heads down. If they're into sustainability initiatives and things, they're just doing them, below the radar, and a lot of them are just getting on with it and hoping they don't get noticed, aren't they?
I suppose so. I mean, of course, the rhetoric, which I've been also personally somewhat skeptical about in the past, has been, well, these initiatives don't really have a cost. They're entirely consistent with being a profitable enterprise. And boards have sort of wanted to say that, if you like, for obvious reasons. And now I think, if you want to say anything positive about the present situation, people will have to be pretty clear and prove that, that it actually is sensible to have more diverse hiring practices, and that will bring you a better workforce because you'll be fishing in a wider pool, and just having, graduates from 2 universities who can wear a suit and a tie, that's not going to produce you the workforce for the future. And so people are going to have to be proving that to a more rigorous extent than they were before. There was this sort of rhetoric that, no, this isn't actually to do with engineering social change. It's to do with, increasing our profitability, because if we have a more diverse workforce, they'll be more predictive and they'll be more able to access and understand the communities they're serving, blah, blah, blah. You could do it. You've probably written some of it. But that's, I think people are going to have to be more rigorous about proving that, because that's probably your best answer. You know, if you say, look, it may look like a DEI initiative, but it's actually a productivity initiative at heart, you know, then I think it'll be difficult for even the US administration to sort of force you off it. But I think it'll require people to be a bit more rigorous and a bit more objective about the outcomes of these policies.
But you yourself found yourself in the middle of these sort of culture wars with the Farage-Coots thing, didn't you? Because there was no doubt that what really got under their skin, those sorts of people, was the phrase that he was potentially at odds with our position as an inclusive organization. Now, to someone like me, that sounds absolutely perfectly reasonable. But it clearly enraged a certain sector of our society, didn't it? Hearing a phrase like that, a sort of a judgment like that. I mean, how tell us how you sort of disentangled yourself from something like that, because you were an inclusive organization, and that committee that you had there made a judgment about something like that, but it then all blew up in your face, didn't it? I mean, how did you extricate yourself from that?
The effect was that there was a political fuss, as you're quite right to point out, and therefore the regulators responded to that. And they carried out an investigation into the general issue of debanking, you know, asking the question, is it the case that banks generally, or NatWest in particular, are getting rid of people, you know, or debanking people because of their political views, you know, and the answer to that was, broadly speaking, no. You know, they did not find evidence of that on any kind of scale, and that where there were individual cases, they were justified on commercial grounds. And I don't want to go into the actual details of the Farage case. I don't think it's appropriate for me to do so now, but generally that people were saying, well, you know, this individual, whoever it was, or this group, you know, are saying things which are potentially at the borderline of whether they're legal or they're not. We keep on having to monitor them because, you know, etc. And therefore, this is not a group we wish to be associated with. And you know, some of the issues as arose in debanking was particular campaign groups, etc. You know, where banks, not just NatWest, had said, you know, this is too much trouble. Really, it's not commercially viable to keep on monitoring people all the time. So I think that in this case, although the initial way it was covered suggested that this was a sort of broad issue, and therefore it wasn't just about one individual, it was a broad issue of debanking. In the end, the regulatory investigation didn't support that. So gradually, it stopped being a broad political phenomenon, if you like, and became just a case of an individual who, you know, therefore not unexpectedly had a particular grievance, which eventually was resolved. But it became an individual case.
Hasn't a business got a right to decide who it wants to do business with, though? If it doesn't like the cut of someone's jib, any business, if you're running a corner shop and someone comes in and is unpleasant to you behind the counter, then you don't have to serve them, and that must be the right of the business, isn't it?
And I'm sure you've been banned from many pubs, Matthew, which is a case in point. I mean, yes, I think ultimately you do, but there is something a bit special about banking. Unfortunately, you know, if you are banned from a pub, as people say, look, you've had one too many. You know, you can probably just go down the road, and as long as you sort of spruce yourself up a bit, splash some water on your face and go in and ask for a pint somewhere else, you probably get one, you know. So, I mean, you're not really being excluded from an important element of life. Whereas in the case of banking, you know, if you're told the bank won't accept you, you know, well, quite probably you're going to find it difficult to go to another one as well, because they'll probably say, well, where was your account and why have you not got one? And I understand that it's a bit more sensitive. I mean, it's a little bit like in COVID, the banks were regarded as an essential service. We were required to stay open and to have branches, not every branch every day, but I mean to have branches open around the country because we were deemed to be an essential service.
I can't let you go without talking about Europe and Brexit, because you're one of the few people who was willing to put his head above a parapet, and you described it as a significant mistake. Where do you see the potential reset of our relationship with the EU landing at the moment? What do you sense that this government is up to? What does it want? And how can it go about achieving it without kind of upsetting, the people within the red wall who wanted it in the first place?
Until the implications of the war and the implications of Trump's policies became clear, I felt that the government was not doing very much, frankly. That they were engaged in a little bit of tidying up. There's supposedly supposed to be a review of the deal. That's provided for. That's normal. When the Commission agrees a trade deal with countries, 3 years later they go and have a look and see if it's working as intended. And that was going to produce a little bit of tidying up, in veterinary agreements and things like that. That was about the size of it, frankly. And in the election campaign, Starmer was very nervous, clearly, about saying anything more than that. It actually even said there is no case for rejoining the single market. That baffled me as a sentence. Clearly, there is a case. What he really may have meant was we're not going to go there for political reasons, but clearly it was a case. So I think until the sort of Trump war nexus came together sharply 2 or 3 months ago, that was really all that was going on. I mean, nothing very much more than that. Now, however, of course, the general impetus towards European collaboration on security and defense and everything, and the fact that they're now having to spend a lot more time together in trains with or without cocaine, as the French report, but that has clearly shifted the dial and biased people towards saying, well, if we can find more ways of collaborating, we should do that. And therefore, I think that the possibility now is of something more serious on the defense side. Now, immediately the French raise fish, and there's youth mobility and all those kind of things. It's not easy, but I suspect that there will be a greater coming together on defense and security, and that is something which I do not detect a great deal of opposition to in the country. I think people can see that just makes sense, and whatever your views were about Brexit, that doesn't seem to me to cross any kind of red line. Where you go from there, I think, is a bit more uncertain. I mean, I personally would think that, you could reopen the issue of the customs union. I think that's possible because, after all, Turkey is in the customs union. I don't think that's an impossible thing. They're clearly not going to be in the EU in my lifetime, or indeed yours. Whereas the single market strikes me as being a much more problematic notion, because there you're a rule taker. And whereas a country like Norway may shrug its shoulders and say, well, can we really expect Norwegian standards to be followed around Europe? No. Therefore, we may as well take what's available, and that benefits for us are great. Whereas in the UK, I cannot see it. I mean, certainly not financial services. The idea of just saying we're going to take whatever rules emerge from Brussels without our being consulted on them, and we'll implement them, I just don't think that's going to happen. So I think the single market notion is not one that's on the agenda, unless you really, decide that actually you're ending up back in the EU. That's kind of where you're going. So I would hope that they can do something in the customs union territory, but even that, I think, is quite uncertain.
Now, you spend a lot of time in Paris now teaching at Sciences Po. What do the French want from us now, do you think?
The French have always been ambiguous about the UK. Obviously, the financial area is the one which I know the most about. And in the financial area, the French have always understood that London was the European window on the world, if you like. It didn't surprise them that a French bank would have its main trading floor in London to do dollar transactions, yen, etc. That was they understood that. They might regret it, but they understood it. They didn't think they could really change that. What gradually annoyed the French more was during the last, the 15 years up to Brexit, London became the kind of onshore financial centre of Europe, as well as the kind of offshore financial centre. And you found that there were French bankers doing deals with French companies in London. And Italian, as you know, there's sort of a whole Italian banking system, Italian banks with Italian bankers in London doing, rights issues and whatever for Italian companies. But the whole activity was taking place in London. And the French don't like that. They say, well, why, and particularly post-Brexit, they say, how can that really be that a huge economy like the EU, 400 odd million people, can have its main kind of financial centre being offshore? They don't understand that. Indeed, you can see why they don't. If you look at it from that perspective, you can see. So they are quite keen to attract business back to Paris. And they're having some success with that. Quite a few businesses have decided to sort of set themselves up as their European headquarters in Paris. They got the European Banking Authority back into Paris from London, which has been quite significant as well. And at the moment, I think that they are, the sensible ones in France. They say, well, we can do that. We can get Paris back to be an important onshore centre for the EU, accepting that a lot of the offshore stuff, as it were, will still be done in London. And I think that kind of new, slightly changed equilibrium is one that I think we have to live with. We made this bed, we've got to lie in it. I mean, I don't think we could reasonably expect to leave but remain the central financial centre for the whole of the EU.
Finally, then, where do you think we're going to be with Europe in 5 years' time? Is it more going to be more or less the same as it is now, or do you think that then things might get closer?
I think there'll be more security cooperation. I think that unless complex government, if you like, will deal with individual issues, whether it's youth mobility or food standards or whatever, we'll probably pick them off one by one rather than have a complicated, comprehensive deal. So I think gradually there'll be some simplification of rules and some deals on individual cases. But I don't see in 5 years anything fundamental changing.
Well, Howard, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Howard's had a long and distinguished career, and as we discussed, he's been through many shocks during that process. It seems at the moment as if we're in a sort of state of perma-shock, one thing after another. But I think there's a sense of optimism that it is sort of fixable, and Trump won't be there forever. So wait for the next one, which is going to be with Sue Garrard, who used to be with Unilever. She invented sustainability there, and she's got a very particular take on this subject. See you for that episode soon.